Good evening, lecturer and classmate. My name is Zoe from group number 2 with the other 5 members, Panyawan, Mundi, Sokheng, Najita, and Bisat. And the topic that our group is going to present in this video is about the political dimension of globalization and its positive and negative impacts on a country. There are 6 main points which will be covered in this presentation. The first point is about the introduction, while the second point is about the dimension of globalization. The third one will be about an overview of political dimension of globalization. The next one is about the impact of political dimension, both positive and negative. And the fifth one is about the suggested solution to um, the negative impact of political dimension, while lastly, the last point is about the conclusion. Now let's go to the introduction. In here, I will talk about a brief review of the concept of globalization. In the last 2 chapters of our book, we have learned that the concept of globalization is a complex and controversial concept because there are many different definitions of globalization out there, which mean not everyone agrees with the same definition. Some people would define it as a process, some would define it as a system or force, and so on. So basically, people tend to define globalization differently based on how they have experienced globalization or how they have been impacted by globalization on their own. However, a much better way to understand globalization is that we need to identify it as the ever-increasing interrelatedness or interdependence among all the nations, countries, and states, cities, provinces, districts, and so on, with regards to all the interrelated aspects of life, such as politics, economics, culture, education, environment, religion, and so on. In other words, globalization refers to the intensification of global interconnectedness, which has been made possible through the advancement of transportation and information technology, allowing people to move, interact, and exchange goods more quickly and in a less complicated way. Our book also suggested that globalization is a multi-dimensional phenomenon, which means it contains many different aspects or dimensions. Now for you to learn more about the different dimensions of globalization as well as a deeper meaning of political dimension of globalization, I will hand it over to my other group member.
Hello everyone, my name is Panyawan. Before we get into our main topic today, I'll be giving you a brief review on the various dimensions of globalization. As you have already learned from previous lessons, globalization is a topic that has not been made clear yet. This is also true for the classification of globalization dimensions. So to keep it simple, I'll be using the classification provided by our school book, Globalization, a very short introduction by Manfred B. Steger. According to Manfred, globalization is divided into 4 main dimensions: economic dimension, political dimension, cultural dimension, and ideological dimensions. Economic globalization refers to the intensification and stretching of economic interrelation across the globe. The flow of new technology and capitals is the major cause that stimulate the national economies to open up their market and create new linkage around the world. Furthermore, the establishment of international economic institutions and transnational cooperations also play an important role in creating the current economic system around the globe. Moving on, the cultural globalization refers to the intensification and expansion of cultural flow across the world. However, this concept has been around before the modern time. It is just that with the advancement of technology, the dissemination of culture has increased significantly. Next, we'll talk about globalism or ideological globalization. It has five central claims. After a critical examination of these five claims, Manfred concluded that it consists of powerful narratives that sells an overreaching neoliberal worldview, thereby creating collective meaning and shaping people's identity. And finally, the political globalization refers to the intensification and expansion of political interrelation across the world. And that's it for my part. I will let my teammate take over from here. Thank you.
So, thanks to Bong Panyawan for listing down all the dimensions of globalizations. So, let's move on to my part, which is about the overview of political globalizations. So, among all the dimensions of globalizations, our group decided to choose one dimension, which is about the political globalizations to discuss in our presentation today. So, before diving deep into the detail of political globalizations, I would like to guide you to the definitions of political globalization first. So, what is political globalizations? Based on what I have been doing research so far, I eventually figured out that there are various of definitions of political globalization which have been defined by so many authors. So the first author is the definition from Mr. William R. Thompson. He defined political globalizations as the expansions of global political system and its institutions in which inter-regional transactions are managed. And according to Mrs. Valentine M. Morgadam, she defined it as an increasing trend toward multilateralism in which the United Nations play a key role to an emerging transnational state apparatus and toward the emergence of national and international non-governmental organizations that act as watchdogs over governments and have increased their activities and influence. While the definition from Manfred Stacker, he defined it as the intensification and expansions of political interrelation across the globe. Last but not least is the definition from Mr. Colin Crouch. He is the only person that defines the political globalization in the longest definitions. So, from his perspective, he defined political globalizations as the growing power of institutions of global governance, such as World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, which is known as IMF, and the World Trade Organization, which is known as WTO, and he also defined it as the spread and influence of international non-governmental organizations and social movement organizations and transnational advocacy networks operating across the borders and constituting a kind of global civil society. And according to all the definitions that have been defined by those authors, we can come up with general meaning of political globalizations. So the meaning is that Political globalization is the growth of worldwide political system, both in size and in complexity, and the system include national government, the governmental, intergovernmental organizations, as well as government independent elements of the global civil society, such as international non-governmental organizations and social movement organizations. From what I have researched, the creation and the existence of the United Nations is one of the clear examples in the process of political globalizations as it brings nation states together. However, political globalization is not limited to action involving traditional nation state players. In fact, it is characterized by the nation state becoming merely one of the players in the political sphere, having to compete with corporations, other global institutions, notably those concerned with economic issues and also NGOs. And this is the end of my part. And the next part is about the impact of political globalization, which will be presented by Sok Heng.
The positive effects of globalization. Globalization effect on democracy, freedom, and human rights. This increase in international trade and travel signify the growth of interactions among people, which is a positive factor that promotes a multiracial and associative democracy. The development of urban institutions, parties, and political groups lead to an increase in middle-class citizens, which are the main component that greatly impact the politics and economics. This is due to the increase of private businesses and firms, as well as the awareness of human rights. As international communication became a necessity for the world's development, globalization had led to an uprise of civil societies that follow the principle of freedom of speech, expression, and beliefs. It is one of the main elements that represents democracy, capitalism, and liberty. With the increase of active human participation in the world, the global culture of human rights has become prominent and raised a big topic amongst the political world. For example, the United States had a profound history with globalization. It went through many political phases throughout history. The change in goods also brought along new ideas, beliefs, and religions. This laid the foundation of new evolution for Americans. Back then, the country had a brutal history of slavery and exploitation, which now can be seen as extremely unethical and a breach of human rights. The movement of people across the world into America has brought along an abundance of different opinions on the matter, which led America to value a system of liberty. In addition, the United States now witnesses the appearance of new political independents who came from different cultural backgrounds other than Caucasian. This means that America is now approaching political governance with a different point of perspective that had allowed them to grow exponentially and be characterized as one of the most developed countries in the world. Globalization effect on nation. Globalization allows citizens to have power in becoming a big influence in a country's economy. This serves as a stabilization feature that balances out the authority of the government and the power of rights of the people. More importantly, new independent firms, parties, and organizations will be developed and raise a different method of governance. Innovative and novel ideas will be developed along the way through the exchange of knowledge. For instance, Singapore's had their politics change drastically due to globalization. With the increase in trades and immigration, Singapore became one of the most prominent countries, renowned for its prosperous economics and cultural diversity. The country had suffered severe poverty, unemployment, and shortage of food after World War II. With the influence of communism and globalization at the time, Singapore laid the groundwork for the introduction of a new governance system of totalitarian. This is a system of dictatorial which restricts individual opposition to the state. However, globalization had an impact on this system which turned it into a new version of totalitarian. Though political rights and democracy were limited as expected, private businesses were supported, which led to the stability of economics and politics in the state. Now, Singapore is exercising a democratic system of government as their economic flourish. This served as an example that globalization does not necessarily mean democracy. New ideas circulating around the world helps to discover new methods and strategy. Globalization paves the way for the world to project towards a system of capitalism and liberty, but its positive impacts on the politics are not limited to that.
Thank you, Najata, for the well presentation about the positive impacts. Now let's move on to the next point, which is negative impacts. Along with the bright side, globalization also has some negative impacts on the political. First, the problem of the powerful council is the veto power. Veto is the council that has 5 permanent members, including China, the United Kingdom, France, the United States, and Russia. Veto was created after World War II. Veto has some important functions, including to investigate threats, to recommend a resolution process, to impose leave sanctions, and to enforce military intervention. The most important power of the veto is that one single negative vote from any permanent member carries the power to reject a resolution, meaning that veto power has the overpower that causes the country, especially small country, to fall into problems. Some veto permanent members use their power to protect their own interests, that is, getting away from what veto is created for. For instance, China has used veto power several times to against Taiwan's independence. In the same way, Russia used the veto power 12 times to against draft resolution concerning the Syrian civil war. The draft would have included investigating chemical weapons, impose sanctions, and referred Syria to the International Criminal Court. The veto power that used in this case caused 400,000 people died since 2011. Let's move on to the second impact from the political globalization is it makes some countries less independent. As we all know that small countries or developing countries need support from the international, especially dominant organizations such as IMF and EBA from the European Union. Developing countries need to follow the rules that regulated by those organizations to get the fund or the support. So, to follow the policy that given by the organization, some countries need to change their government structures or even change their law. On top of that, the leader of the countries might lose their power on their people and sometimes cause the problem in their own countries. Furthermore, if one country breaks the rule of those organizations, they will take back or reduce the support, which will make the country fall under pressure.
Thanks again for your good present about the negative impacts of the political globalizations. So within the negative impacts, we also come up with the solutions as well as the suggestions which could feasibly be done to reduce desirable effects of the aspect on the country. Okay, and be said who responsible for the solutions to negative impacts of the political globalizations. So the solution to cope with the veto power used by the Permanent Five of the United Nations is to restrict it. Permanent members use the veto to defend their national interests, to uphold a tenet of their foreign policy, or in some cases to promote a single issue of particular importance to a state which caused the United Nations to lose power as a peacekeeper, who helps countries navigate the different paths from the conflict to peace. The permanent five have obligations under the UN Charter as well as international humanitarian and human rights laws, and not to undermine the effectiveness of the UN or that body of law. And the political arguments against using the veto in these situations should also weigh heavily on the permanent five. However, some countries, including permanent five members, France and the United Kingdom, have supported the concept of voluntary restraint. That basically means the permanent five would have a responsibility not to use their veto power in situations where mass atrocities are being committed, like Syria, for example. The responsibility not to use veto is the idea that the permanent five at the United Nations Security Council should voluntarily refrain from using their veto in the events of atrocities. The solution is to either get rid of the veto powers or to make it less frequently used. In that way, the use of veto power would not frustrate the possibility of UN becoming effective in solving international conflicts. Another solution to cope with the second impacts of the political globalizations that small or developing countries lost their independence due to IMF and EBA who changed the government structure of the countries. So our suggested solution is that both parties should hold conference meetings for negotiation to find common points to benefit all parties. In order to receive all dissatisfactions, the international organization should diminish pressure on changing the structure or law of the countries that are served, because each country needs complete independence and rights for leading and developing the country. Moreover, both independence and right would assist all those countries to make right decisions in country. With these negotiations, we believe it would help construct a robust relationship between the countries and the organizations and also help remain the peace. So that is all for my part, and lastly, I would like to invite Zoe again to sum up our presentation. Thank you.
Lastly, let's move on to the conclusion. To sum up, our group have talked about a brief review of the concept of globalization and its various dimensions, and then went a bit deeper into the definition of political dimension of globalization and define it as the growth of the worldwide political system, both in size and complexity. In addition, we also look at some positive impact or political dimension of globalization. The first positive impact is that the political dimension promotes democracy, freedom, and human rights through the increase of international trade, travel, the increase of human participation at the global level, and the emergence of civil societies. And secondly, political dimension allows people or citizens of a country to have a power to influence their own country's economy. And lastly, the positive impact of political dimension can be seen through the change of political system of some countries over the world, through the spread of different methods of governance raised by new independent firms, parties, and organizations. And this can clearly be seen through the example of the country of Singapore, which was raised earlier in this presentation. Along with the positive impact of political dimension of globalization, we have also raised about the two negative impacts. The first negative impact of political dimension is related to veto power. as we have noticed that globalization has allowed the weight of power to adversely affect less powerful country or less developed country, or putting them at a disadvantage. As we already know that according to the Wedo rule, every kind of agreement or resolution cannot be met until all the members of P5 or of the Wedo agrees. So as a result, some of the countries who belong to the Wedo or who is the member of P5 would use this veto power wrongfully in order to gain their own benefit or interest. For example, we can see that China, who is a member of P5, has used this power several times to against with the independence of Taiwan. The second negative impact of political dimension is that globalization promotes dependency of a nation, making some countries like the developing countries become less independent and powerful in leading their own countries. For example, some developing countries would need to follow all the rules regulated by the international organization, or sometimes they have to change their law and policy and even their governmental structure in order to get the fund or support from those international organizations like the IMF or EU. So after discussing about the problem brought about by the political dimension of globalization, our group has come up with two suggested solutions. The first solution is to put a restriction to the use of veto power, meaning that some P5 members should not be allowed or should be banned from using veto power if they are known to be committing some kind of evil acts which could potentially harm the other country. While the second solution for the second negative impact of political dimension of globalization is to hold a conference meeting for negotiation. This is the chance for the developing countries and the international organization to talk in order to find a common term which can benefit both parties. By negotiating, our group believes that it is possible for the developing countries to gain back their independence, right, and power to lead and develop their countries without receiving much pressure from the international organization like the IMF and EU. So that's all for our presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. If you have any question, please feel free to ask.